When the cold handcuffs clicked around her wrists, her breath caught in her throat. After all those years spent fighting for justice as an FBI agent, she couldn't believe this moment was real. But it was. The guns aimed at her, the hate in the officers' eyes, and the whispers of the crowd gathering on the sidewalk. It was all real. "Hands up! Get on the ground!" shouted the officer in the white uniform, aiming his gun directly at her chest. Sasha Williams tried to show her badge with trembling hands. "I'm an FBI agent. You're making a mistake," she said, her voice both angry and desperate. But the officer wasn't listening. With a mocking smile, he muttered, Yeah. Every thief thinks they're an FBI agent." As Sasha was forced to kneel, her eyes welled up. She had never bent or bowed her entire life, never submitted. But now, on one of the busiest streets in New York, she was being humiliated in front of dozens of onlookers. The sharpness of the cuffs was hurting her wrists, but the real pain was echoing deep in her soul. Sasha's mind was filled with memories of the years she had fought for justice. The years spent taking down mafias, surviving dangerous operations. And now she was being treated like a thief on the street. The crowd gathered around, whispering and watching the scene unfold. Some had pulled out their phones, recording. A young man shouted, "She said she's an FBI agent!" But the officer dragged Sasha toward the patrol car without even blinking. When the car door opened, Sasha heard an angry voice. "Officer, what do you think you're doing?" A man with furrowed brows and a dark suit quickly approached them. It was Special Agent Marcus Reed, Sasha's partner. The officer let out a mocking laugh. "You want me to believe she's your partner? She's a thief." Marcus pulled out his FBI ID and raised it in the air. "Agent Williams has worked with me for 4 years. Let her go or you'll be tried for this racist nonsense." But the officer was stubborn. "Then we're going to the station. If what you're saying is true, it'll clear up there." Sasha took a deep breath. Her eyes were burning, but she wouldn't cry. She wouldn't cry. The door of the patrol car slammed shut, and with the hum of the engine, they headed toward the station. In that moment, Sasha felt as if she had reached her breaking point. Anger, disappointment, and helplessness were all mixing together. She had been fighting for justice for years, but now, who would fight for her? As the sirens echoed through the dark streets, Sasha's eyes burned, but she wouldn't cry. The inside of the car reeked of a smell she had despised for years, a nauseating mix of old leather seats, metal handcuffs, and sweat from a night spent inside. This was the car used to transport criminals, but tonight, it wasn't a criminal inside she was. Behind the iron-barred window, the officer glared at her. His name was James Thornton. His facial features were harsh, his eyes sharp, and there was always the hint of a mocking smile at the corners of his lips. The name tag on his left chest was slightly worn, his uniform pristine, but the gun on his belt had been worn down from years of use. He was one of those men who thought he was dispensing justice on the streets. His prejudices were ingrained in his blood, and he believed his power was absolute, just another cop. Sasha, unable to straighten her back with her hands cuffed, never once looked away from him. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. Thornton leaned back, glancing at her in the rearview mirror, and smiled mockingly. "A mistake? A black woman gets caught leaving an expensive store, the alarm goes off, and she tries to run. But sure, you're an FBI agent, right?" Sasha shuddered inside. She wanted to say something, but the words got caught in her throat. She had spent her whole life fighting against men like him, but now she was sitting like a convict at the mercy of one. The vehicle stopped in front of an old stone building. It was one of New York's oldest police stations. The gray stones of the building had darkened over the years from the rain, and moss was sprouting from its cracks. Yellow lights were glowing from the upper windows. Despite the late hour, the building still felt alive. The moon cast a pale light in the sky, and the air was freezing. Thornton opened the door, yanked Sasha out of the car, and as soon as her feet hit the ground, she stumbled for a moment but quickly regained her balance. Inside the police station, the heavy smell of coffee and tobacco hit her face. The atmosphere was hot but suffocating. Paper piles scattered over desks, phones ringing from every corner, and officers rushing by with quick steps. But the most unsettling thing was the way people were looking at her. As soon as Sasha entered, everyone fell silent. Officers sitting at their desks raised their heads and stared at her. Some had curiosity in their eyes, others with disdain. In the back, an older officer took off his glasses, looked Sasha up and down, and shook his head. "Is there a problem?" Thornton said loudly. "She's not the first criminal we've caught here." Laughter rang out. Another officer mocked, "This is the FBI agent?" Yeah, right. Sasha's anger was about to burst. In the career she had fought for respect. Now, she was the subject of mockery, and nobody wanted to believe her. Just then, a door opened at the end of the corridor. A man in a perfectly pressed dark blue suit entered. The FBI emblem on his leather badge gleamed on his belt. Agent Marcus Reed. He quickened his pace toward Sasha. His face was rigid, his jaw clenched. He was Sasha's most trusted person, but right now, she couldn't read his expression. "What the hell is going on here?" Marcus growled. Thornton rolled his eyes. "We're arresting criminals." Marcus stormed toward Thornton. "She's not your criminal. She's my partner, and you're going to pay for what you've done." But Thornton just shrugged. "If what you're saying is true, prove it." Sasha's throat tightened. It hurt that even her own partner had to prove her innocence, but this was her life. She always had to prove herself. She always had to show evidence, and sometimes, nothing was enough. Sasha felt the weight of the moment deep in her bones. All eyes were on her. The dim lights of the police station and the faded yellow walls made everything even more grim. The smell of cigarette smoke and stale coffee was making her stomach churn, but what truly made her nauseous were the stares of the people around her. The faces of the officers in front of her told the whole story. The contempt on Thornton's face wouldn't change, no matter who she was. They didn't believe her, or rather, they didn't want to. Marcus took a step forward. He adjusted the collar of his suit and locked his eyes on Thornton. "Look, if you don't realize the mistake you're making right now, this is going to end badly for you. Let her go." Thornton crossed his arms, tilted his head slightly, and chuckled quietly. "You and this so-called FBI agent, you're not the ones who set the rules here. This is my turf, pal." Marcus's eyes narrowed. His knuckles whitened as he clenched his fists, but he kept his composure. Sasha knew his anger well. They had worked side by side for years, and when Marcus gritted his teeth like that, she knew he wanted to tear someone apart. But this wasn't their turf. A wrong move here could give Thornton the excuse he wanted. Sasha took a deep breath. The cuffs on her wrists were starting to leave marks. "All right," she said calmly. "If you're making this accusation, at least I expect you to present some proof. Let's watch the cameras." There was a brief silence in the room. Thornton rolled his eyes. "No need for that. The security detectors went off, and you tried to run." Sasha tilted her head slightly. A rising anger was growing inside her, but she tried to stay calm. "I wasn't running. There was someone behind me. If you check the security cameras, you'll see who the real thief is." Thornton gritted his teeth. He hesitated for a moment but then turned and signaled to a young officer. "Bring up the security footage." The police station suddenly felt like a courtroom. The officers sitting at their desks quietly watched what would happen next. Some had curiosity in their eyes, others a hidden amusement. Some secretly hoped Sasha was wrongly accused, as it would prove their prejudices were justified. The young officer, his hands trembling, sat down in front of an old CRT monitor. After pressing a few keys on the keyboard, the store's security camera footage appeared on the screen. At first, it showed Sasha leaving the store. She wore dark gray pants, a stylish white shirt, and a black blazer on top. Her long black hair was tied neatly in a ponytail. She was carrying an expensive handbag, but that bag belonged to her. She was the one who took it. Then, a few frames passed, and there he was. Behind Sasha, a hooded man was quickly rushing out. As the man was leaving the store, he slid his hand under his coat to hide something. The alarm went off right at that moment. The footage was paused. The silence in the room had become suffocating. Marcus carefully examined the expression on Thornton's face. The officer's face was tense, his teeth clenched. "Ah," Marcus said, spreading his arms. "I guess we saw what Sasha stole, huh? Oh, sorry, we didn't see it, because she didn't steal anything." Sasha was doing everything she could to stay composed, but the pressure of the handcuffs on her wrists had become unbearable. She clenched her hands, took a deep breath, and fixed her eyes on Thornton. "Are you going to keep me in handcuffs?" The muscles in Thornton's jaw twitched. He clenched his teeth and briefly locked eyes with Marcus. Then, reluctantly, he opened the cuffs. As the metal cuffs fell, the redness on her wrists appeared. Sasha rubbed her wrists, but her gaze never left Thornton. This wasn't just a mistake. This was prejudice from the start. They hadn't even bothered to listen to her. They had immediately declared her guilty. At that moment, Marcus took a deep breath and stepped closer to Thornton. "Don't think you're getting away with this. We're reporting this, and you know what this is going to cost you." Thornton's face tightened, but he didn't say anything. Sasha held her head high. All eyes were on her, but there was no longer any mockery. Something had changed now, but the wound inside her was deep. This was something she had always fought. To bring justice, sometimes you had to endure injustice. But today, she knew she had won this battle, and she would never again let anyone treat her this way. The cold air in the police station was now making it hard to breathe. As she rubbed her wrists, she looked at the marks left by the cuffs on her skin. They were red. She knew they would bruise. But the real wound was in places unseen, deep within her, in the depths of her soul. Marcus was still standing tall in front of Thornton. His tone was filled with a calm, yet threatening calmness. "This won't end here." Thornton swallowed hard, but still tried not to back down. "Are you threatening me, Agent Reed?" Marcus let out a mocking laugh. "Threaten you? No, this is a promise. The whole police department will hear your name. What you did tonight could end your career, and believe me, I'll make sure of it." At that moment, Sasha took a deep breath and slowly moved toward the door. She couldn't stay here anymore. The atmosphere in the police station was weighing down on her like a heavy burden. The whispers continued, but she no longer listened to them. As all this unfolded, the past played before her eyes like a movie reel. She remembered the day she went on her first field assignment. She was 23. She had graduated from the FBI Academy with top honors and was assigned as a field agent. During her first operation, everyone in her team had been skeptical about her. Is she ready? She's young, plus a woman, and a black woman. How long could she last in the field? But Sasha had proven them wrong, again and again. She took down the mafia. She caught terrorists. She survived ambushes and death traps. She never gave up. But no matter what she did, she couldn't shake the looks. And now, after all these years, to be randomly called a thief by a police officer in a shopping mall, this hurt more than anything. Her eyes started to burn, but she held back. She wasn't going to cry, because crying would make them think they had won. At that moment, Marcus caught up with her and lightly placed his hand on her shoulder. "Sasha, are you okay?" Sasha lowered her eyes. Her throat was tight. She couldn't speak for a few seconds. But then her voice came out soft and cold. "We're never really okay, are we?" Marcus took a deep breath. He stayed silent because he understood what Sasha meant. Being okay, feeling safe, knowing that justice applies to everyone. These things had never really been possible for her. As they reached the door, Sasha looked up at the night sky. The cold New York air hit her face. The streetlights cast a yellow glow, and the streets were nearly empty. But in that moment, even this vast city felt small. Marcus pulled a pack of cigarettes from his jacket pocket. He rarely smoked, but he'd light one up during stressful moments. He looked at Sasha, seeing how broken she was. "What are you going to do now?" Marcus asked as he lit the cigarette. Sasha smiled, but the smile was cold. It was filled with anger. "I will keep fighting," she said quietly, "because no matter what they do, I won't give up on them. But there is one thing I won't forget, Marcus." Marcus lifted his head. "What?" Sasha answered without hesitation for even a moment. "This country will never fully protect me." At that moment, Marcus fell silent, as if struck dumb. Because this was a truth they had known for years but had never spoken out loud. But for Sasha, that truth had been proven tonight, and she would no longer be the old Sasha. Now the fight wouldn't just be against criminals, it would also be against the corruption within the system. As Sasha walked through the streets of New York, she was someone entirely different. While the cold wind cut across her face, deep inside, she felt an indescribable emptiness. She put her hands in her pockets, but it wasn't just her body that was cold. Her heart felt frozen. What had happened to her wasn't new. She had faced similar things at every stage of her life, but this time, it had hit harder. Because the justice system she had dedicated her years to and sweated for couldn't protect her. Because those handcuffs hadn't just tightened around her wrists. They had also tightened and shattered her belief. Sasha took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the illuminated skyscrapers of Manhattan. This city was always bright, always full of energy, but now even those lights seemed fake, just like everything she had fought for. At that moment, her phone in her pocket vibrated. The message was from Marcus. "Do you want me to take you home?" Sasha read the message for a while. Her fingers trembled, but she didn't respond. Because she didn't want to go home. Going home meant loneliness. And when she was alone, her thoughts would eat her up. Instead, even though it was past midnight, she decided to go visit an old acquaintance. Brooklyn, an old bar. When Sasha walked in, the scent of the old wooden bar filled her nostrils. This wasn't a loud place. Soft jazz music played in the background, and a few customers were sipping their drinks at the bar. Sasha walked directly to the bar. Behind the bar, a large man with a black shirt and slightly grown beard stood. When he saw her, his eyes squinted slightly. "Sasha?" Sasha shook her head. "I need a drink, Reggie." Reggie stared at her for a few seconds, then turned around and grabbed a bottle of whiskey. "Rough night?" Sasha let out a bitter laugh. "When isn't it?" After filling the glass, Reggie placed it in front of her. "What happened?" Sasha took the glass in her hand but studied it for a few seconds before drinking. That moment, she realized something. Her hands were still trembling. She brought the glass to her lips, the alcohol burning her throat, and her eyes started to fill with tears, but she still wasn't crying. Reggie leaned over the bar, resting his hands on it, and looked at her. "Sasha, I've known you for years. You've never come here with that expression. This is different, isn't it?" Sasha looked him in the eye. She took a deep, suffocating breath. And then, she finally broke. The tears she had held in all night began to silently roll down her cheeks. But not a single sound escaped her mouth. Reggie froze for a moment, then slowly shook his head. "Tell me." Sasha gripped the glass tightly. Then she began to tell him everything she had been through. All night long. The shame she felt. How she had struggled with her anger, how the system had crushed her. And in the end, there was just one question left. "Reggie, why are we still fighting?" Reggie took a deep breath, staring at her for a long time. Then he gave the answer, "Because if we give up, we accept that we've lost." But for Sasha, something had already changed, and the resentment inside her had already begun to turn into something else. Revenge. Sasha decided to investigate the corruption within the police force more deeply. This had become a personal war for her. How many more cops like Thornton were there? How many people within the system were guilty like her, yet never got punished? Sasha was no longer just an FBI agent. She was a warrior walking on the dark side of justice. And to win this war, she would burn her whole life if necessary. The next morning, Sasha woke up with exhaustion. As she sat in her room with a lingering headache from the night before, she picked up her phone. Marcus had sent a message. "I found out something about Thornton. We need to talk immediately." Sasha's anger flared up again. Thornton's face came to mind. Those arrogant eyes, that condescending tone. But Marcus's urgent call meant that things were bigger than she had thought. She jumped into her car and drove to the address Marcus had sent. Meeting Place, an old FBI archive. When Sasha walked inside, Marcus was already waiting for her. A file was open on his computer screen. Marcus stood up from his chair and looked at her. "I don't know what you'll feel when you see this." Sasha looked at the screen, and her breath caught. The file on the screen was an old police report. It was from 1997. One night, the police had raided a house. The report mentioned Thornton's father, the name of a black teenager his father had killed. The file stated that the father had been released due to lack of evidence. Witness statements were contradictory, but Sasha understood everything. Thornton had grown up learning what his father had done, and apparently, over the years, he had been molded by the same hate. Sasha continued reading the file. The murdered child was Sasha's uncle. As her eyes locked on the screen, the whole world seemed to spin around her. Her heart raced. She pressed her hands to the desk, trying to take deep breaths. Thornton's hatred had roots in a generation before him. He had become a man like his father, a sickness within justice. Marcus stood quietly watching Sasha's shock, but Sasha's eyes had already turned dark. This man wasn't just a cop who had humiliated her. He was the son of a monster who had tainted her family's history. And Sasha knew what she had to do. By the time she arrived at Thornton's house, the sky had already darkened. She knocked on the door. When Thornton opened the door, first surprise appeared on his face, followed by a mocking smile. "Miss me, FBI?" But Sasha's face was expressionless. Her eyes were burning with fire. "I'm going to show you something," she said in a calm but sharp voice, "and after that, you'll either hand over your gun and go confess, or—" She didn't finish her sentence, but the darkness in her eyes said it all. Thornton took a step back and furrowed his brows. "What are you talking about?" Sasha took her phone out of her pocket and held the screen in front of Thornton. She opened the file about his father. And for the first time, the arrogance in Thornton's eyes turned to fear. For the first time, he took a step back. For the first time, he felt weak in front of Sasha. This is nonsense," he muttered, but his voice trembled. Sasha took a decisive step forward. At that moment, she felt the weight of the past, the pain of years on her shoulders. "Your father's blood runs through your veins, Thornton, and you're just like him." Thornton's breathing grew faster. "You can't tell anyone," but Sasha just laughed, an angry, bitter, painful laugh. "You've been crushing and humiliating people for years, but your greatest fear is the truth coming out." Thornton took a shaky breath. "What do you want?" Sasha thought for a second. "Justice? Revenge?" She didn't know, but one thing was certain: Thornton was not going to win this war. She raised her phone, staring into Thornton's eyes as she dialed a number. "This is an official tip-off to the FBI. I've got a major case." Thornton's eyes widened. He tried to snatch the phone from Sasha's hand, but she had already taken a few steps back. And at that moment, the arrogance on Thornton's face was gone forever. He was just a scared man now, just like his father. When Sasha closed the door behind her, she looked up at the sky. New York was shining again. But tonight, something had changed in this city. The sins of one generation had ended with the struggles of another. But Sasha still felt an emptiness inside, because in this story, no victory was ever entirely clean, and no justice could ever fully heal the wounds in her soul.